Some bonds are unbreakable, even by time. Buddy waited every single day, holding on to a promise that was never fulfilled. But what if love never truly fades? What do you think about Buddy's incredible loyalty? Have you ever seen a story like this in real life? Let us know in the comments. And while you're at it, tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. If you don't want to miss tomorrow's heartfelt and powerful story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. A loyal dog's 2-year vigil and the soldier who never returned. Buddy sat on the hill, motionless, his golden brown fur ruffled by the evening breeze. His deep, tired eyes were locked on the road below, staring into the fading horizon as the sun dipped beneath the fields. He came here every evening without fail, his body still, his heart heavy with an unspoken longing. The small town below had grown used to his presence. A lone figure against the sunset. Some of the younger folks thought it was just a habit, a quirk of an old dog set in his ways. Others believed it was instinct, something buried deep within him. But those who had lived here long enough knew the truth. Buddy was waiting. No one knew exactly when it had started, but for over 2 years, Buddy had made the same journey, leaving the quiet streets of town, climbing this same hill, and taking his place in the grass, eyes trained on the road as if he were expecting someone. The older townspeople whispered about him, their voices hushed with a mix of admiration and sorrow. He's waiting for his best friend. Mrs. Porter, the kind-hearted woman who ran the town's small bakery, would tell anyone who asked. And he's not leaving until he sees him again. The townspeople cared for Buddy the best they could. They left scraps of food and fresh water at the base of the hill, hoping he'd eat. Sometimes children would stop by to pet him, their little hands stroking his thick fur as they whispered comforting words he didn't understand. But Buddy remained distant. His heart belonged to someone they would never meet. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Buddy let out a soft, almost inaudible whimper. It wasn't just a sound. It was a memory, a distant echo of something long gone but never forgotten. Somewhere, deep inside, he still believed in a promise. A promise made long ago by the person he loved the most. And until that promise was kept, he would keep waiting. 2 years earlier, Buddy had belonged to Captain Jake Turner, a 34-year-old soldier with a heart as strong as his loyalty. From the moment Jake found him as a scrappy pup on the outskirts of town, they had been inseparable. Their days were filled with routine, adventure, and quiet understanding. Every morning, Buddy would wake to the sound of Jake lacing up his boots, ready for their 5-mile runs by the lake. Evenings were spent by the fireplace, Buddy curled at Jake's feet, his tail thumping softly against the hardwood floor. And at night, under a sky full of stars, Jake would talk to him like an old friend. "You know, Buddy," Jake would say, his voice low and thoughtful, "some things in life you can always count on, and you, my friend, are one of them." Buddy would sit attentively, his intelligent amber eyes locked on Jake, as if he understood every word. In a way, maybe he did. But then, one morning, everything changed. A crisp, official-looking envelope arrived in the mail, dreading, the kind Jake had been orders. The weight of duty settled over the small house like a thick fog. Jake tried to hide his tension, forcing a smile, but Buddy knew better. He sensed the shift, the unease in Jake's movements, the long pauses when he packed his gear. That night, Buddy refused to leave Jake's side. He lay by his boots, his head resting against them, as if anchoring him in place, as if refusing to let him go. But the morning still came, and with it, the moment Buddy had feared most. As the first light crept over the horizon, Jake knelt down, gripping Buddy's fur with shaking hands. "You have to stay here, Buddy," Jake whispered, his voice barely holding steady. "I'll be back before you know it." Buddy whined softly, his tail wagging weakly, as if trying to believe him. Then the car door shut. The engine rumbled to life. And as the tires kicked up dust on the dirt road, Buddy ran after it, his paws pounding against the earth, his heart racing with panic. He ran until his legs couldn't carry him anymore, until the car was nothing but a distant blur. From that day on, he climbed the hill and waited, because Jake had made a promise. And Buddy believed in promises. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, but Buddy never stopped waiting. Each morning, as the sun broke over the town, he climbed the hill, his eyes locked on the distant road where Jake had last disappeared. He sat there for hours, through rain, wind, and even snow, his ears perking up at every distant sound, hoping, praying that it was him. The townspeople tried to help. Mrs. Porter, the bakery owner, left fresh food and water at the base of the hill. Children would visit, their small hands stroking his thick fur, whispering, "He'll come back, Buddy." But Buddy didn't move. He wasn't waiting for food or comfort. He was waiting for Jake. Seasons passed and the town changed, but Buddy's loyalty never wavered. Even when the leaves turned crisp and red, when winter coated the ground in thick snow, he never missed a single evening. The villagers admired him, pitied him, but deep down, none of them could bring themselves to tell him the truth, because Jake wasn't coming back. The war had taken him, a roadside ambush in a foreign land, the kind of fate that too many soldiers faced. But Buddy didn't know that. Then, one evening, a stranger arrived in town. He was a soldier, Sergeant Mike Reynolds, a man in his late 30s with a tired gaze and a slight limp. He had served alongside Jake. When he heard about the dog on the hill, his heart grew heavy. He knew what it meant. He had been there the day Jake fell. He had heard his last words. And now, standing at the foot of the hill, he saw the pain that no one had dared to speak of. For a long moment, Reynolds just watched Buddy. The way the old dog's body tensed every time a car passed, the way his ears twitched at every distant sound. He was still hoping, still believing. Reynolds clenched his fists. How do you tell a dog that the person he loves isn't coming home? Instead of speaking, he did the only thing he could. He climbed the hill and sat down beside him. And for the first time in 2 years, Buddy wasn't waiting alone. For the first time in 2 years, Buddy wasn't alone. Sergeant Mike Reynolds sat beside him on the hill, the weight of unspoken grief settling between them. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Buddy wasn't waiting for words. He was waiting for Jake. Reynolds sighed, his eyes fixed on the fading horizon. "He loved you, you know," he finally whispered. His voice was rough, thick with emotion. "You were his best friend." Buddy didn't react at first. His gaze remained locked on the road, his ears twitching slightly at the sound of Jake's name. But then, Reynolds reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, something worn with time but still recognizable, a dog tag. Jake's dog tag. He set it down in front of Buddy, the metal glinting under the last rays of sunlight. "This was his," Reynolds said quietly, "and I know he'd want you to have it." Buddy hesitated. He leaned forward, his nose brushing against the cold metal, and then a whimper, soft, barely audible, but filled with something deep, something raw. Reynolds swallowed hard. He had seen war, had lost men he called brothers, but this was something different. The dog lay down, curling his body around the tag as if it were the most precious thing in the world, as if, in that small piece of metal, Jake was still there. The town watched the quiet ritual from a distance. The old woman from the bakery wiped away a tear. Children who had once offered scraps of food now stood in silence, understanding, for the first time, what Buddy had been waiting for all this time. That night, Buddy didn't return to the hill alone. For the first time in years, when the sun dipped below the trees, he followed Reynolds back into town. His waiting was over, but his love for Jake, that would never fade. That night, for the first time in 2 years, Buddy didn't return to the hill. Instead, he walked beside Sergeant Mike Reynolds, his steps slower than they had once been, but steady. The dog tag hung from his collar now, swinging gently with each movement. A small piece of Jake, carried with him forever. The town was quiet as they made their way back. People watched from their porches, from windows, from storefronts. Some smiled, some wiped away silent tears. Everyone knew what this moment meant. Buddy wasn't waiting anymore. But grief doesn't fade overnight. The next morning, Buddy hesitated at the edge of town. His paws stopped on the familiar path leading up to the hill, his body tensed, torn between the routine that had defined his life and the unfamiliar pull of something new. Reynolds noticed. "You don't have to go up there anymore, boy," he said softly, kneeling beside him. "But if you want to, I'll go with you." Buddy turned his head, looking at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time, He made a different choice. He stepped away from the hill. Instead of climbing to his usual spot, Buddy followed Reynolds back to his home. It was small, modest, but welcoming. For the first time in years, Buddy walked through a door instead of sleeping under the stars. He curled up on an old blanket by the fireplace, his body sinking into the warmth, his tail giving the smallest, that hesitant wag. And just like that, he belonged somewhere again. Days passed, then weeks. Buddy still carried Jake's memory, still wore his tag, still lifted his head whenever he heard footsteps on the road. But his eyes weren't just searching anymore, they were living. Reynolds took him on long walks through the woods, along the lake, through town. On some days, Buddy would stop, stare toward the horizon, as if remembering, and Reynolds would sit beside him, waiting, letting him hold on to the past for just a little longer. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in fiery reds and oranges, Reynolds felt a familiar nudge against his hand. Buddy looked up at him, eyes bright, ears perked, his tail wagging, stronger this time. He wasn't waiting anymore. He was home. Some stories touch the heart in ways we can't explain. Buddy's loyalty, his unwavering hope, and his final journey home remind us of the deep bonds we share with those we love. But what do you think? Have you ever seen a story like Buddy's in real life? Do you believe animals can sense loss and hold on to memories just like we do? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel, connecting people from different places through the power of storytelling. If Buddy's journey moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss our next emotional story. We have another powerful one coming tomorrow, and you won't want to miss it. Do you have a loyal pet or know a story of devotion like Buddy's? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one.